True, we love life, not because we are used to living, but because we are used to loving. There is always some madness in love, but there is also always some reason in madness. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is arguably the most sophisticated philosophical work in the history of philosophy. Yet, compared to other sophisticated works, it is still a joy to read because of Nietzsche's style of writing. Nietzsche called Thus Spoke Zarathustra a symphony, a holy book, the fifth gospel, and humanity's greatest gift. Let's start with the title. Who was Zarathustra? Zarathustra, also known as Zoroaster, was an ancient Persian prophet and a founder of Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions. He is believed to have lived sometime between 1500 and 1000 BC, although precise dates are uncertain. His teachings are thought to be the first to divide the world in forces of good and evil. Zoroastrianism is often considered one of the earliest forms of monotheism. Nietzsche's use of Zarathustra to spread his message is thus an ironic wink. A new set of values will be preached in this book the same way this happened a few thousand years ago. The subtitle of the book is A Book for Everyone and No One, which just shows the great marketing and writing skills Nietzsche had. It is an intriguing way of luring you in, while at the same time signaling that this work might be misunderstood. Nietzsche often reflects on the message conveyed by his philosophy and the possibility that people might not be prepared to listen to it. The book was published in 1884 after struggling with his health over the past years. Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra's first publishing counted only 100 copies after a dispute with his publisher. When changing publisher, Nietzsche decided to add several new prefaces and parts to his old books in order to republish them. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was first published in 3 parts. Later, another part was added. The structure of the book could be compared to the structure of an opera, 3 parts of drama and 1 part comedy. It is already far too hard to understand the first 3 parts, let alone the later added 4th, so in our explanation we will focus on the first 3 parts of this book. An interesting philological fact is that in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche changed his writing style completely. It is baffling for scholars that this book has come from the same hand as his others, as there is barely any continuity in style between them. This, in my opinion, just shows the genius that Nietzsche is. Right before his famous breakdown, Nietzsche writes to his good friend Koselleck, "For the past 4 weeks I have finally understood my own writings. Not only that, I admire them. In all seriousness, I never knew what they really meant. I would be lying if I claimed, other than the Zarathustra, that they had impressed me." Nietzsche himself thus implies that his most important and meaningful book is the one we are about to delve into. Nietzsche's Zarathustra is written in an esoteric Bible-like style, which gives the book a feeling of familiarity for people who have read the Bible. Most texts are written as a sort of sermon and end with the phrasing, "Thus spoke Zarathustra." One of the great urban myths surrounding this book is that it was one of the most read books during the First World War. The most read book during the war being, of course, the Bible. Within the work of Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra is unique because it is not critical by nature, like most of Nietzsche's book, but rather positive and ideal shaping. It is the book that announces the coming of the Übermensch. Without any further ado, let's jump into the first part of the book. Thus Spoke Zarathustra tells us the story of the prophet Zarathustra, who at the age of 30 climbed up a mountain and stayed there for 10 years. The age of 30 is of course a symbolic age, as prophets like Jesus and Muhammad and similar figures such as Buddha started spreading their message at this age. We see a different movement already. Zarathustra remains within his loneliest loneliness in the mountains. After 10 years, Zarathustra starts a sort of conversation with the sun. Historically, the sun has represented the highest principle or God within philosophy. For Plato, the good is the highest principle that shines through the realm of ideas and makes them knowledgeable for us. Augustine will refer to God who illuminates our minds like rays of sun. Zarathustra alludes to the fact that every sun must set, referring to the fact that the idea of God has lost its meaning. The German word for setting is Untergang, which can also be translated to descending in English. Zarathustra wants to leave his mountain and descend back to humanity to spread his message. But what is this message? Several ideas will be presented throughout this book, and without proper knowledge of these ideas, the metaphors and allegories will be impossible to understand. Let us thus not follow a linear path through the book, but first properly introduce Nietzsche's most important concepts: the death of God, the will to power, and then the Übermensch. The death of God. For most readers, the mentioning of the death of God is revolutionary. Of course, it is quite an astonishing fact that belief in Europe is diminishing. Christianity has been a guiding light for the past 2 millennia. But it is not that Nietzsche is famous for recognizing Christianity's demise. In the history of philosophy, one finds tons of mentions of the declining belief in God, long before big old mustache philosopher mentions it. Philosophers such as David Hume, Baruch Spinoza, and even Kant mention or allude to the fact that God plays a less central role. The death of God for Nietzsche is a warning for what follows. How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions. Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is it not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? There are vast consequences to the fact that God is dead and the looming threat of nihilism. Do you want to learn more about the death of God? Check out our video on the death of God, where we delve deeper into this concept and its most common misunderstanding. The death of God is directly linked to another concept of Nietzsche, the will to power. The will to power is Nietzsche's core principle. It is a metaphysical one, meaning that it is at the base of all reality. But what is the will to power? The will to power is the idea that everything in life strives for power. There are 2 main aspects to this principle: an aspect of power and an aspect of creativity. Let's first focus on the aspect of power. Nietzsche comprehends our reality as one of conflict and chaos. 2 substances meet, they clash, and one overcomes the other. This happens on all levels of life. He recognizes this in space, where stars and planets collide, but also in nature, where an animal hunts another, where the lion plays with its prey. One doesn't have to think far to recognize this play of power in human interaction. It becomes a little more complex when Nietzsche recognizes it on a societal scale. Our set of values, he argues, are ways in which a group of people reign over another. In the ancient Greek world, the values of strength and fame were very prevalent, and thus the group of men who were stronger were in power. Inherent to this play of power is that we suffer, yet the suffering, Nietzsche claims, is inherent to power and what makes us stronger. However, according to Nietzsche, something went awry when Christianity reigned over societal life. Christianity has flipped the table. Those who are weak and meek will inherit the earth. If you are sick, weak, without friends, without joy, suffering, don't worry. In heaven, things will become better. Yet for Nietzsche, Christian doctrine is a denial of what life really is: will to power. And while Christianity does have power, in its doctrine it preaches of non-violence. Nietzsche calls this decadence and life denial. Instead of abolishing suffering, we should embrace it, use it to make ourselves stronger. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. In short, the principle of the will to power is an idea of what constitutes reality. Everything strives towards power, to overcome, to gain strength over another. Suffering is inherent to this process of overcoming and should thus be embraced. Yet, in Christian doctrine, this principle is denied. But power is not the only aspect of the will to power. There is also a creative aspect to it. In the introduction of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the sun starts setting, signaling the time of a new dawn and a new set of values. Inherent to the will to power is that new sets of values are created in an endless process. Zarathustra refers to the will to power as a striving that is tirelessly generating. There is thus a cyclical nature to reality. Values are created, they conflict with the ruling set, one prevails and reigns until the next set of values is created to conflict with. The will to power thus has an aspect of power where it wants to overcome, and a principle of creativity where it generates a new set of values. The death of God is the setting of one set of values making place for a new one. How then should we comprehend the Übermensch in light of the will to power? The Übermensch. To answer this question, as the new meaning of life, the new set of values that Nietzsche is trying to provide to humanity. As Nietzsche writes in the Zarathustra, The Übermensch shall be the meaning of the earth. I entreat you, my brethren, remain true to the earth, and do not believe those who speak of you of superterrestrial hopes. Behold, I teach you the Übermensch, he is this lightning, he is this madness. Behold, I am the prophet of this lightning, and a heavy drop from the cloud, but this lightning is called Übermensch. To many people, the Übermensch is the blonde-haired beast. Yet I would like to argue that the Übermensch should be understood as a sort of horizon, something to work towards for humanity, yet never attained, because that would imply the end of the process of overcoming. Nietzsche wants us to live according to nature, and nature that is will to power. As Zarathustra preaches, man is a rope, stretched between the animal and the Übermensch, a rope over an abyss, a dangerous crossing, a dangerous wayfaring, a dangerous looking back, a dangerous trembling and halting. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. What is lovable in man is that he is an overgoing and downgoing. Man should overcome himself and strive towards more. The same way that a climber tackles a mountain. He suffers when climbing, but greatness awaits at the top of the mountain. Against the image of the Übermensch, Nietzsche introduces the idea of the last man, someone who is unable to self-overcome and create, who lives in denial of the will to power, the enigmatic figure who thinks that they have already found all the answers to life and is not open or curious about anything. This is the very reason why the Übermensch, in my opinion, should be understood as a horizon to strive towards. If one loses his strive, one becomes the last man. Let's recap. In order to understand Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you have to comprehend three core concepts of Nietzsche. The death of God, which speaks to the fact that the belief system upheld by Christianity loses its authority. Their values are no longer supported, the looming threat of nihilism is near. The will to power, which has a power aspect and a creative aspect to it. The power aspect alludes to the fact that everything in life strives toward power, and the creative aspects allude to the fact that new values are created to collide with and strive towards power. Nietzsche upholds that with the death of God, this process of creation and collision has come to a halt. That is why he criticizes Christianity. Yet Christianity is losing its position, so there is a need for a new set of values. That is where the idea of the Übermensch comes in, a step beyond humanity, a goal to strive towards, or in other words, an horizon that propels us towards greatness. The idea of the Übermensch is strongly intertwined with the overcoming of suffering. One gains strength out of their suffering. Yet that is where the book takes a turn. Zarathustra talks with the grandest of joy on the new meaning of life, the Übermensch, yet at the same time feels something is wrong. Something is missing. In the second and the third part of the book, Zarathustra's joy and spirit dwindles as he is faced with fundamental issues. It is 1884 when Nietzsche writes of the Übermensch, one of his most known ideas. Yet, interestingly enough, it is only really mentioned in the first two parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche wrote a lot of works after Thus Spoke Zarathustra, like Beyond Good and Evil, The Genealogy of Morals, Twilight of the Idols, and The Antichrist. Yet in none of these works does he mention the Übermensch. So let us examine why the Übermensch takes up a less vital role in the work of Nietzsche by taking aim at two other core concepts introduced in the later parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Eternal Recurrence of the Same and Amor Fati, or one's love of fate. The problem. In the second part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the ideal of the Übermensch is confronted with an issue. How does one handle the suffering that is not fully overcome, that has become trauma, resent? Nietzsche claims that resent is that which fuels nihilism. Resent is a form of life denial. If we cannot overcome our suffering, it haunts us, makes us bitter, takes from us our joy of life. Within Thus Spoke Zarathustra, resent is described as the disgust for our unwanted past. Revenge is the will's aversion of time and its it was. To Nietzsche, the hardest thing is to affirm to an unwanted past. Take for example a mother who has lost her only child. Can she ever not experience resent? An iron will is needed for that. In the Grave Song, Zarathustra preaches on the graves of his youth and how he wants to bring to these graves an evergreen rod of life, which alludes to the affirmation of traumas from his youth. Yet Nietzsche writes on the problems of this affirmation. All days shall be holy unto me, so spoke once the wisdom of my youth, truly the language of a joyous wisdom. But then did my enemies steal my nights and sold them to sleepless torture. Ah, where has the joyous wisdom now fled? How does the Übermensch tackle this trauma? By transforming trauma into greatness? Is that always possible? Redeeming the past and recreating every it was into this is how I wanted it, that would be salvation for me. The redemption spoken of is one that presupposes that we can will back in time, but is precisely that is not possible. Nietzsche himself has to admit to this. The will cannot will backwards, that he cannot break time, and the desire of time, that is the loneliest misery of the will. The Übermensch is confronted with the problem of suffering that has turned to resent. This introduces the question of the eternal recurrence. The eternal recurrence. As Zarathustra says, the things that were are the most terrible for our joy of life. People experience resent over traumas they have experienced in the past. These fuel resent, and resent to Nietzsche ultimately fuels life denial. This introduces the problem for the Übermensch, an unrelentless striving forward that is being held back by traumas and resent for the past. One cannot will backwards, one cannot change the past, as is so beautifully described by Nietzsche. The pride of youth is still upon you. Late have you become young, but he who would become a child must overcome even his youth. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche shares that the very thought of the eternal recurrence is at the basis of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He writes in Ecce Homo on the eternal recurrence, "It belongs in August 1881. It was penned on a sheet with a notation underneath, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. As I was walking near the lake of Silvapana through the woods that day, I stopped at a mighty pyramidal rock not far from Surley." The importance of the idea is obvious through the annotation of 6,000 feet beyond man and time. It is there that we have to find the answer to the question of resent for our past. The eternal recurrence is a thought experiment that claims time is not linear but cyclical. Imagine that everything that has ever happened is happening and will happen in the future will repeat itself in exactly the same way over and over again for eternity. This means that every event, every action, every moment of joy or suffering, every decision you've made or will make will occur an infinite number of times. Nietzsche mentions the idea in several books. A clear meaning of the thought experiment of the eternal recurrence is found in the gay science in the parable titled The Heaviest Weight. What if, some day or night, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you all in the same succession and sequence, even the spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with its speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal?" In the Zarathustra he adds, "Behold this gateway, dwarf," I continued. "It has two faces, two paths meet here. No one has yet followed either to its end. This long lane stretches back for an eternity, and this long lane out there, that is another reality. And if everything has already been there, what do you think of this moment, dwarf? Shouldn't this gate also have been here before?" The eternal recurrence is Nietzsche's way of putting the problem of resent towards an ill-willed past in the spotlight. Nietzsche even tried finding a scientific explanation for the idea of the eternal recurrence. In a future video, we will delve deeper into this idea. The cruelty that comes with a reality such as the one Nietzsche paints with his will to power is daunting. Life is cruel, suffering is inherent to it, we all strive for power, and now, to end it all, you have to go through it for eternity? How does one grapple with this? Amor Fati. Nietzsche's answer to the question of the eternal recurrence is that of love of fate. By answering yes to the eternal recurrence and to give place to one's trauma, by accepting them as chunks of granite which you cannot change. A part of you is fated to be what it is, not changed, not reshaped or made better. The passive acceptance of one's fate. In order to fully comprehend the idea of Nietzsche, we will look at the text, the second dancing and song in which Zarathustra and life converse. Zarathustra preaches a sort of love poem for life, but life answers in disbelief. Then did life look thoughtfully behind and around and said softly, "Oh, Zarathustra, you are not faithful enough to me. You love me not nearly so much as you say. I know you think of soon leaving me." Life is convinced that Zarathustra had not been capable of accepting the abysmal thought of his own unwilled past. But Zarathustra knows the secret of life, that it is will to power and recurs identically into eternity. "Yes," answered I hesitatingly, "but you know it also." And I said something into her ear in amongst her confused yellow foolish tresses. "You know that, O Zarathustra, that knows no one." And we gazed at each other and looked at the green meadow over which the cool evening was just passing. And we wept together. Then, however, was life dearer to me than all my wisdom had ever been. In other works, such as The Gay Science, Nietzsche speaks of the idea of Amor Fati. In the fourth part of this book, Nietzsche writes mockingly that for the new year, he too is allowed to make a wish. This wish goes as follows. "For the new year, I still live, I still think. I still have to live, for I still have to think. Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum." Today, everybody permits himself the expression of his wish and his dearest thought. Hence, I too shall say what it is that I wish for myself today, and what was the dearest first thought to run across my heart this year. What thought shall be for me the reason, warranty, and sweetness of my life henceforth. I want to learn to see more and more as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor Fati, let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all, on the whole, someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer. Amor Fati is thus the idea of accepting one's fate and accepting trauma and resent for the past. The idea of the Übermensch thus fades away in the second and third part of the book. There seems to be a tension in the work. The Übermensch seems focused on activity, value shaping, striving, and transforming one's suffering into greatness. Amor Fati seems focused on a passive accepting of one's past. How do we have to interpret the dichotomy between these two ideals? I would personally argue that in later works, Nietzsche's answer to this question is a reference to a sort of balance. One should try to still strive towards the transformation of suffering into greatness or value shaping, but at the same time accept where this is not possible. That is a fine line, a tightrope walking exercise, if you will. In future videos, we will address some of the later ideas that Nietzsche introduced. For now, I leave you with the same paradox Nietzsche was left with when writing this beautiful work of art that is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. With a good understanding of the relationship between 5 important concepts that Nietzsche introduces, the death of God, the will to power, the Übermensch, the eternal recurrence of the same, and Amor Fati, the understanding of the different metaphors and aphorisms should be a joyful walk through Nietzsche's thought. Have I covered everything that can be found in the book? No. But you should be able to use the framework of concepts that I have introduced to dissect for yourself the meaning of the aphorisms. If you are interested in delving deeper into the work of Nietzsche, here are some of the books I would advise you to read. Lawrence Haytap's Nietzsche's Life Sentence, Coming to Terms with Eternal Recurrence, and Lawrence Lambert's Nietzsche's Teaching, Interpretation of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I will leave these titles in the biography beneath this video. Did you enjoy this exploration of one of the books of Nietzsche? Which work would you like to see us do next? Are there any other works you have a problem tackling? Let us know in the comments. Please do like, comment and subscribe, as it is a sign that we are on the right path with our content. Thank you. Bye.